Welcome, everybody. My name is Josh Horwitz. I'm a professor of the practice at Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. I'm also the co-director of the Center for Gun Violence Solutions. Tonight, we're going to be talking about firearm purchaser licensing. For those of you who don't know about the center, we work on gun violence prevention, we work on gun violence research, and we have three guiding principles. Number one is that gun violence is an epidemic that we need to treat as a public health epidemic. Number two is that we focus on objective and nonpartisan research, and everything that we do is based on that. And number three is that we do advocacy. So we take our research and we make it work in the world. And that's why we're doing here tonight, to educate people about the value of firearm purchaser licensing as a gun violence prevention strategy. Just a little bit about myself. Importantly, not only am I a professor at Johns Hopkins, but I'm a proud Virginian. I live in Patrick Hope, Delegate Hope's district, as well as Barbara Favola's district, House District 1, Senate District 40, and I've worked on gun violence prevention in Virginia for 20 years. It's something that I think that we can do better with in the Commonwealth. When you see the statistics of who's dying, we can do a much better job. And firearm purchaser licensing is one of those things that will really help us with that. And it's at our center, one of the things that we think can, if we have one policy that we really want to emphasize and save lives, it's firearm purchaser licensing. Lots of other important pieces, but we want people to learn about this policy tonight. And with us to help us learn about this policy is Delegate Patrick Hope, who represents the first district and is in Arlington and is my member in the House of Delegates. So we're really excited about that. We also have with us tonight Senate Majority Leader Scott Surovell, who represents the 34th district, and will talk to us about about firearm purchaser licensing. We're also really lucky to be joined by my co-director, Dr. Cassandra Crifasi, who's the co-director of the Johns Hopkins Center for Gun Violence Solutions and is a nationally recognized expert on firearm purchaser licensing. We also joined by Kelly Roskam, who is a director of law and policy at our center and works in this field and is a resident of Fairfax. If you want to ask questions, and we encourage you to do so, please put it in the Q&A function, and we'll get to it at the end of the presentations. Also, there's a Q&A, a QR code where you can see some of the research that we've been working on. And if you really want to get into some of the things that we're going to talk about tonight, that will give you all the information that you need. So for the next 25, 30 minutes, we're going to talk about what firearm purchaser licensing is and the evidence that supports it and why it's an important policy to save lives in Virginia. So, Delegate Hope, if you're with us, please take it away.
Thank you, Josh, and thank you to everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you. I want to talk a little bit about the legislation and the proposal. I first introduced the bill in the 2024 session, and the bill was tabled with the understanding that it would be sent to the Crime Commission for a study. Wanted to get a comprehensive state study to take a look at the data that's out there with other states, and I think we'll probably hear more about other states' data, the costs, the implementation, and really get some background in terms of what the impact will be on a permit to purchase or firearm permitting process. And so, just sort of at a high level, the bill would aim to reduce gun violence by requiring everyone who purchases a firearm to first get a permit from a licensed dealer. And I think as lawmakers, we have to look and see what is it that actually solves the problem with gun violence and reducing gun violence. And I'm convinced, seeing the data, seeing the impact in other states, that this law will save lives, probably more than any law that we've passed in Virginia. You know, we've come such a long way in Virginia in making an impact on reducing gun violence in some of the laws that we've passed over the years. But I do believe that this law will save more lives. The data is out there to show that. and more than any single law that we've passed. The law would require this permit system, and it would introduce additional safeguards beyond just traditional background checks, which we're all familiar with. This is more of a better background check, but it also focuses on training and eligibility standards so that anyone would want to purchase a firearm from a dealer. They must present this valid permit that would be issued by the Virginia Department of State Police. And before that you could be issued a permit, you'd have to take a firearm safety training course within, say, the last 2 years taught by a certified instructor, with the idea that if you're going to handle a firearm, you should at least have some training, some live fire training to know how the firearm operates. And so that's going to be very important. You're also going to have to be fingerprinted as well too. We want to make sure that the person that's coming before us is actually the person who that they say they are. And so having those kinds of things or those kinds of public safety rationale, it will ensure that the buyers will understand that safe handling and storage. It will also reduce accidental shootings as well. I think that when you look at other states that have done this, I believe there are 13 states plus the District of Columbia, that number might have gone up, that have already implemented these laws, having these background checks, requiring fingerprinting, having that firearm safety course. We've seen a reduction in the number of homicides, which I think most people focus on the most because that's what really gets a lot of the media's attention. But also just as important, and actually even at a higher rate, are the rate of suicides as well too. And this law has proven itself to have such a great impact. So again, the bill was introduced in 2024, and it was sent to the Crime Commission for a study. The Crime Commission just released a comprehensive study on the legislation and proposal, and it's something that I intend to bring in next session. And I think there's a lot of opportunities for us to build on the success that we've had over the last several years and really pass something that could be meaningful in lowering the rates of homicides and suicides in Virginia. I'll go ahead and stop there, but I certainly look forward to the rest of the panel and appreciate the opportunity to be with you this evening.
Delegate, thank you so much for talking about this, talking about your bill. We're excited about the opportunities moving forward. And to talk a little bit about that more, about the bill and about his view on this is Senator Scott Surovell. Senator, you're on.
Hey, thanks. I appreciate you all inviting me to be on tonight. I'm happy to work with my class of 2009 classmate Patrick Hope to try and make some more progress on firearms. Back in 2020, we had a wonderful year. The last time we had a political environment like this, we got universal background checks done, a 5-day waiting period. We passed the red flag law. We passed we didn't say one handgun a month, the one gun a month law that I think Governor Wilder originally enacted that got repealed. And so we have another opportunity this year to make some real progress when it comes to firearm safety, notwithstanding everything going on at the U.S. Supreme Court. And I also forgot about the local authority law that I passed to give localities the authority to regulate some certain events and situations like their buildings. So I'm the vice chair of the Crime Commission this year, and Patrick carried the bill a couple years ago, and we agreed that this issue was so important that thought we should devote the resources of our Crime Commission to really focus on this to make sure we had good data and come up with some good solutions. Patrick kind of outlined the rough outline of what the bill is and what it does. I think it's important to note a couple just things about what he said. The fingerprint background check is always sort of the gold standard background check, where somebody can't produce a fake ID or there's other things that sometimes can evade a background check if you don't use fingerprints to verify somebody. I think the class requirement is kind of an enhanced requirement over what we require right now. Right now, if you want to get first of all, you don't have to show any kind of class to buy a gun today. You do have to get a concealed carry permit. You do, but it's not really much of a class. I think this is sort of a more robust education requirement than that. But uh, most people, I think, identify if you're going to be given a dangerous instrumentality to carry around that can kill a person, then maybe you ought to have some training in that. Just like we do to allow somebody to drive a car. So that's something we're going to do. In terms of other states, I think a lot of people ask, because we don't have this in Virginia, where's this been done elsewhere? 14 other states have an FPL law, and so does the District of Columbia. In other states that have adopted these laws, what you find is they have reduced homicides, reduced suicides, and this will hit different parts of our state in different ways. Some estimates have said this could reduce homicides by about 600 per year in Virginia. And I think it's always important. People focus a lot on homicides. I don't think a lot of people remember that 2/3 of gun deaths in Virginia are actually suicides. And So this not only will help us when it comes to, for example, violent crime, but also it'll help save people who are in distress. And there's data that backs that up. So I also just want to note that these kinds of laws have been upheld by the courts. There's been a lot of there's still some ambiguity out there about exactly what the state of the law is in light of the U.S. Supreme Court's case in Heller and the cases that have followed about what are reasonable gun firearm restrictions and what aren't. And the courts have upheld permit to purchase laws like this in our federal courts. And so we're not treading on any unconstitutional rights. I'm sure a lot of you will get emails or whatever saying this is unconstitutional. It's a violation of my Second Amendment rights. That's not the case. So we're on solid legal ground pursuing this policy. So that's my view of it. I'm glad we're taking some more steps. I'm sure we're going to take steps on red flag and AR-15s, a few other things this session. But I think this will be a big centerpiece of some of the gun firearm safety legislation we passed this session, and I'm proud to be part of it. I'm glad we have these partners.
Senator, thank you so much. That issue about constitutionality has been litigated in the Fourth Circuit. Maryland law has been upheld on that. So a similar law in Maryland. So I'm sure Kelly Roskam, one of our panelists, will touch on that. But thank you for bringing it up because it's a very important point that this passes constitutional muster. But let's get into some of those facts and figures you were mentioning. And no better person to do that than the co-director and my friend Cassandra Crifasi.
Great. Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity to talk for a minute. I want to weave together a few things that we've heard so far from the delegate and the senator, just to sort of emphasize again why these laws are as effective as they are. And just really quick, I want to orient us to a couple of weaknesses in the federal system that are directly addressed by firearm purchaser licensing or permit to purchase. So when you walk into a gun dealer, you submit your 4473 and you go through the National Instant Criminal Background Check system. And one of three things happen. You can immediately proceed with the sale, there's an immediate denial, or there can be a delay for additional review. And under this additional review, there are up to 3 business days to complete that check. Find additional records, maybe somebody has a very common name, and you want to make sure that you've identified the right person. Unfortunately, there are reporting gaps and delays. Even some parts of the federal government aren't as good at talking to other parts of the federal government as we might like. And sometimes states are slower at reporting records than we might like. And these federal background checks are only required for licensed dealers. So private individuals, people who meet at a gun show or connect online and then meet in a parking lot, for example, are not required to do a background check under federal law. So firearm purchaser licensing, again, addresses some of these gaps. We heard about the safety training component, making sure people understand the different policies. The fingerprint-based background check is really important for occupational licensure. If you want to do an occupation where you need to have a background check, you're required to get a fingerprint-based background check. It just helps make sure that people who are prohibited are more likely to be identified and screened out. There's some sort of in-person step. Sometimes that's fingerprinting. Sometimes that is the application in and of itself. Obviously, the comprehensive background check that includes local, state, and federal records, and then more time to complete that check, making sure that all of the records are adequately assessed and individuals are properly screened out. You'll see a QR code here at the bottom of the slide. This will take you out to our main report on firearm purchaser licensing. I know Joe has also been putting some Virginia-specific resources in the chat, a fact sheet and a report specific to Virginia, so please check those out. But sort of taking all that together, what we know about how these laws work and why, let's talk about what some of the research shows. So at a really high level, we see lower rates of firearm homicides in cities where firearm homicide tends to concentrate. These large urban cities in states with these laws have lower rates of firearm homicide, 10 to 12% lower. We also see lower rates of fatal mass shootings, including fewer instances of these laws, mass shootings occurring, and fewer people injured should a mass shooting occur. We also see lower rates of suicide, which was mentioned, and this is really important. It's one of the leading causes of firearm death. And we think part of this is better screening, so making sure individuals who have a mental health prohibiting condition are properly identified and screened out. But also it can reduce or prevent impulsive firearm acquisition. So in a state with firearm purchaser licensing, you first get a license before you go buy a gun. In a state without, often you can walk in, buy a firearm, and walk out with it that same day, which means that if I'm in a time of crisis and I'm feeling elevated risk, if there's not that separation in time and space with the process to get the license and this built-in waiting period, you may have impulsive firearm acquisition leading to suicide. We also see lower rates of diversion of guns through straw purchasing. So when Maryland passed our law, our handgun qualification license, we did surveys of individuals involved in the underground gun market and asked them about what had happened in the market after this law passed. People specifically cited that you need to get a license. People talked about guns being more expensive. People were no longer willing to go in and buy a gun for you through a straw purchase because they didn't want to be fingerprinted and have to get a license. We also saw fewer guns recovered in crime in Baltimore City that originated in the state of Maryland. More of the guns being recovered in crime in Baltimore City were coming from places at the time like Virginia or Tennessee or West Virginia. And so it really constrained the local sources of guns available for use in crime. And we've also seen reductions in shootings of police in the line of duty and police shooting civilians in the line of duty. So really robust research. We also have some new work that was just published earlier this year showing that homicide and suicide among adolescents and emerging adults, those aged 15 to 24, is also lower in states that have these laws in place. To give you two more very concrete examples, Connecticut passed a firearm purchaser licensing law in 1995, and you can see that both their homicide and their suicide rates declined pretty significantly, and we did not see a substitution effect, meaning, particularly in the case of suicide, if someone was not able to obtain a firearm and use that to attempt suicide, we were not seeing increases in other mechanisms used. So the total rate of suicide declined in Connecticut in addition to the firearm suicide rate. In contrast, Missouri repealed their law in 2007, and we saw increases in both homicide and suicide following that repeal because they made it a lot easier for individuals to gain access to firearms. There's also a lot of conversation around constitutionality, which we've heard touched on, but also support for these policies. And so the last thing I want to share is that these are actually quite popular. Overall, 72% of US adults support firearm purchaser licensing laws. And you can see it's 2/3 of gun owners, 60% of Republicans also support these laws. Most importantly, to me, as someone who personally owns firearms, if you ask gun owners who live in states where these laws are already in place, it's actually 75% support. So when you can demystify the process, make it less concerning about what may or may not happen, you can actually see higher levels of support in states where these laws are in place. And with that, I will turn it back over to Josh.
Thank you so much. As we move forward, I want to remind people to put their questions in the Q&A. We're going to be here up to 7:15 if you need time. So this is a good opportunity to get your questions asked, whether that's to the legislators or to the folks from our center. Please do so. And I also, and now I just remind people to go ahead and put those questions in. And then also I want to introduce Kelly Roskam, who will talk about some of the constitutional issues, as well as some other items within working on firearm purchase or licensing.
Good evening. Thank you so much for that introduction, Josh. As Josh mentioned, I'm Kelly Roskam. I'm our Director of Law and Policy at the Center for Gun Violence Solutions. I've also been working on gun violence prevention advocacy in Virginia for over 10 years. I'm going to give a brief recap of the firearm purchaser licensing policy we expect to see in the 2026 legislative session, go over some of the data, and then touch on the constitutionality of firearm purchaser licensing laws. So, as we heard, before an individual would be able to purchase a firearm in Virginia under this new law, they would need to apply for and receive a firearm purchaser license from the Virginia State Police. Virginia State Police absolutely makes sense as an issuing agency because they already run the Virginia Firearms Transaction Center. They have a lot of experience and expertise in administering the background check system. Individuals would need to pay a fee as part of their application. Within the 2 years prior to applying for their license, they would need to have completed an approved firearm safety training course from an approved instructor. This training will include, information on the safe handling and safe storage of firearms and ammunition. It will require live fire shooting on a range so that somebody actually has to shoot a firearm before they can go out and purchase. They'll be given instruction on the relevant federal and state laws about lawful purchase, ownership, carry, use, and possession of firearms. This is really, really critical, I think, as individuals are preparing to possess and possibly carry a deadly weapon in their homes and communities. They will be required to submit either to local law enforcement or to Virginia State Police fingerprints to facilitate a background check. This will really help us match disqualifying records with the individual who is actually applying for it, so we can make sure that individuals who are receiving licenses are law-abiding, responsible citizens. The Virginia State Police will have 45 days to process that application once they've received a complete application so that they can ensure that they've gotten all of the relevant records. Once they're issued, a license will be revoked by Virginia State Police upon, finding that they have a disqualifying event. They're no longer qualified to retain a license. Individuals who have their applications denied or revoked will have up to 60 days to petition for review before the circuit court in case there has been a mistake or they're curing some deficiency in the record. We've heard that these laws are associated with significant reductions in firearm homicide, firearm suicide, shootings of and by police, and the diversion of guns for criminal activity. We also heard mention that some research has been done estimating the lives that could have been saved if Virginia had adopted a firearm purchaser licensing law before. This research was actually done by our researchers at the center who used augmented synthetic control methods to estimate that over a 10-year period, had Virginia adopted firearm purchaser licensing, we would have seen 662 fewer homicides and 294 fewer suicides within those 10 years by firearm. As we've heard mentioned, there have been some Second Amendment challenges to other states' firearm purchaser licensing laws. This is due in part to a Supreme Court case that was handed down in 2022 called New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruin. That case was a challenge to New York's concealed carry licensing law, which required individuals to demonstrate a special need above and beyond the general public in order to be granted a license. Importantly, though, the Supreme Court really emphasized that its opinion did not call into question the constitutionality of many of the state's shall issue licensing laws that used objective, narrow criteria and did not include exorbitant fees or lengthy wait times. Maryland's handgun qualification license, their firearm purchaser licensing law, was challenged in a case called Maryland Shall Issue versus Moore. In that case, Maryland's HQL law was upheld against the Second Amendment challenge, in part because they were identifying that this was exactly the type of shall issue licensing system that the Supreme Court had blessed in Bruin. It contained just narrow objective criteria for the issuance of a license, and its fees were neither exorbitant nor its wait times lengthy. These policies are very similar, so we should expect that they would not be struck down by the court. Importantly, this decision from the Fourth Circuit covers Virginia as well. So we are in a very good spot constitutionally. So with that, I'll turn it back over to our moderator, Josh Horwitz.
Kelly, thank you so much for that, and for all of the panelists for spending some time with us and talking about the bill. We got some questions coming in the Q&A, and just remind people to put your questions in. This is a great time to ask, and I have a couple of questions as well. But for the legislators, what's the process look like for moving this forward? How does that work? I know that we have some new legislators here. What committees will this go through, and that type of thing?
I'll go ahead and start on the House side. It would go to the Public Safety Committee, where a lot of our gun violence prevention bills go. We have a particular subcommittee that handles firearms. We got a lot of new members in the House just with the election, and I really appreciate Josh and you and your team putting this panel together and recording this so that people can see and learn about what we've done. I've talked a little bit about it in the last year or two with my colleagues, but like I said, we have a lot of new people that we need to educate on this. And so the bill will be introduced that first week of session, and I'm sure it will be docketed shortly thereafter, and we'll go through the process into the House.
Thank
Yeah,
you. And then,
Josh, and I would say on the Senate side, in the Senate, firearm legislation goes to the Courts of Justice Committee. We don't have as many committees in the Senate, but that's where all of our firearm bills go. We don't have subcommittees either. And so the bill will get heard by the full Courts of Justice Committee. And then it'll also, I'm sure, get vetted by the Senate Finance Committee, because I think there'll have to be probably a significant fiscal impact from this bill with a lot of the sort of computer and human infrastructure that we're going to have to implement in order to properly get this policy deployed. And then we'll go over to the House, and hopefully we'll keep our bills in line. But often things have to end up going into conference because money staff and other people often will disagree about how much money it takes or what needs to happen or some other details. But that's roughly the process. And then it'll go to the governor. By the way, the governor, she has the final say, and she can of course propose amendments or et cetera. But
And if I can just add, because there are some things on the front end that we've got to get in place with state police, I can foresee there being a delayed enactment. And I think that there's some things that we can do to keep the costs low. And I think it should be of less concern to a lot of my colleagues, particularly this very tough budget year that we have. I think over time, if we can set this program up, that it will be self-sustaining, because on the permits, the fees that you bring in, it'll be self-sustaining program, so that no general fund money will have to be used in the future. There might be some startup costs initially, and I think some things that we can do to mitigate that concern, and so it doesn't crowd out any budget areas. So I don't anticipate that there's going to be a heavy fiscal impact, but at least Senate Finance and House Appropriations are going to see that and confirm that is indeed the case. But we've seen it, so we have a lot of history with other states and how it's set up, and I think we can mimic that, and we know exactly what to expect when this law gets rolled out.
yeah, I think that's an important point, that there's some other states who have figured out how to develop this so it's not a drain on the general fund, but is a fair licensing fee that covers the cost, and that's it. So I think there's some models that we have to build on. So that's a really great point, and thank you so much for bringing that up. We've got some questions about fingerprints. So let me start by asking a couple questions from Professor Crifasi. Can you give us a little bit about the value of those fingerprints and what makes them important?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the challenges with what we would call sort of a demographic-based background check, so name, date of birth, race, sex, there are lots of people with same or very similar names, There are lots of Joseph Smiths in the US. Some of them have the same birthday. And it can sometimes be a little bit more difficult to identify people quickly with those common names. If you fly a lot and you have a common name, you can get a known traveler number or a redress number to make it a little bit easier when you're going through TSA, for example. And this would do the same kind of process, but with the fingerprint, making sure that we are correctly identifying the right individuals, you're not producing a fake ID. But also, as I mentioned, there are sometimes criminal records that are harder to find unless you're using a fingerprint-based background check. As many as 10 to 12% of prohibiting conditions are missed on those demographic checks alone. And so it's really important when we're thinking about properly screening and identifying people for firearm ownership that we're using that. As I mentioned, if you want to volunteer in your kid's school, at least in the state of Maryland, you have to get a fingerprint-based background check before you can go serve as a volunteer in your kid's school or go on a field trip, because people have realized that sometimes there are those prohibiting conditions that can get missed. So it's just a really important way to make sure that the laws that we've already set out, people who can't lawfully own firearms, are properly screened out at the background check process.
And then, thank you. And I think that, as Cass, you've mentioned, as a gun owner, when you have a common name, sometimes that can slow down the process. So this can actually help the process, if I'm correct on that.
Absolutely. So if you have a common name, it may take longer than it should for you to get your background check cleared, as opposed to having this fingerprint-based background check. You've gone through it, you have your license. That information is tied to you when you submit even your 4473. It can help expedite that in the future, just make it a little bit easier.
The 4473 is the federal form that you fill out, asking questions about your status and whether you've been convicted of certain crimes and things like that, just so everybody knows that. Following up on the fingerprint issue, someone asked, is there trying to create a database of fingerprints? The fingerprint is used for a check through the NICS system or through state police. We're a point of contact state in Virginia, so that goes through state police. But can you, Cass, talk a little bit about how that's used, and that the point of this is not to create a database of fingerprints, it's to use it through the background check process?
Yeah, so states have operationalized this a little bit differently in different places. So some states, you submit your fingerprint at the time of the check, and each time you go to renew your license, you would submit new fingerprints. Some states have said that's costly for the applicant, and they do retain the fingerprints, but only for the purpose of checking the individual's background when they go to renew, to make sure that they have the best available information. I don't recall exactly how Virginia is planning to operationalize it, but states have done it in those two ways.
Well, fortunately, Kelly Roskam can help us with that question.
The bill, as introduced by Delegate Hope, and this is the bill language that I expect we will probably see in the 2026 legislative session, explicitly states that fingerprint records will be destroyed after the completion of the application process. It also very specifically states that the fingerprints can't be used for any other purpose. So that is the way that Virginia's bill currently deals with retention of fingerprints, which is they don't do it.
That's good to hear, and good thinking, Delegate Hope, on that. So we appreciate that. There's another question in the chat about where we can get more information. We have put QR codes up before. We can put that before, but I think in the chat we put a number of fact sheets in there, and I believe that's available for all the members of the audience, and we'll make sure that we can send those fact sheets around. Cass, I was really interested in one of the figures in the fact sheets that we have that talks about how many lives over a 10-year period this is potentially. It's hard to predict the future, but if you think about other states that have enacted this, what are their experience and what might that look like for Virginia?
Yeah, it's a great question. So first off, it depends on the outcome of interest. So if you're looking at homicide versus suicide, we've got some variable estimates, but we pretty confidently say between 12 and 30% reductions in gun homicide and gun suicide when you look at them together as a whole. Again, you're thinking about separating the screening process from the purchasing process, which makes it less likely somebody will engage in straw purchasing and divert guns for use in crime. It also can delay impulsive acquisition, and 90% of suicide attempts with firearms result in a fatality. And so even though they're not as commonly used, when they are used in a suicide attempt, most people die in that attempt. And so delaying that impulsive acquisition during a time of crisis can really, truly save a life. And so we are estimating, based on what we've seen in Connecticut and some other states, that over a 10-year period, Virginia could have saved over more than 600 lives. And so thinking about the burden of loss of life, thinking about years of productive life lost and the impact on the economy when individuals are dying, this can have really significant impacts, not just for individuals and families and communities, but the economy of the state as a whole.
All right. Well, thank you on that. Since I got you here, let me ask you about waiting periods, because I think, waiting periods are important to allow the process to play out. But there's some really good evidence start developing evidence about waiting periods saving lives as well. So I think it's putting these pieces together that really matter, right? And the waiting period is a piece of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And in the case of getting the license, the waiting period is really most relevant for first-time gun buyers. So individuals who don't already have access to a handgun, for example, they would undergo a waiting period while the firearm purchase application was being processed. And again, this is really important for thinking about reducing that impulsive acquisition and thinking about how can you, if somebody is going through a time of crisis, how might you delay that acquisition to exceptionally lethal means? And what we saw in Connecticut is that the individuals who would have been subject to the firearm purchaser license for the first time, so those in the age group of 21 to 24, for example, we saw the biggest declines in their suicide risk among those young people immediately after the law passed, partly because of that delay in impulsive acquisition for that waiting period that's built in to the application process. So it's a really important way to sort of separate individuals in time and space from harms that they may use to make a suicide attempt.
Okay. Kelly, I want to turn back to you. I think, typically when we work in Richmond, there's a lot of discussion about the Second Amendment. You've gone through that. But there are other states that have licensing. Can you just mention some of those states? And if has been any challenges on them, but we do know that licensing is working. We also know that Delaware recently passed licensing, and there were a couple of court challenges that seem that have not held up so far, and the law is working, I think, as intended. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So, as was mentioned earlier, there are 13 states and the District of Columbia that currently have a form of firearm purchaser licensing law. Those include several states for which firearm purchaser licensing has not yet gone into effect. Washington State recently passed a firearm purchaser licensing law. Oregon passed a firearm purchaser licensing law by ballot initiative several years ago that has been tied up in some court challenges. It was recently upheld against a state right to bear arms challenge in Oregon State Court. It was also upheld in an Oregon Federal District Court against a Second Amendment challenge. Additionally, there are firearm purchaser licensing laws in Connecticut, Hawaii, Illinois, Massachusetts, Michigan, Nebraska, New Jersey, New York. The Delaware law recently went into effect just last month, November 16th, 2025. There had been a challenge seeking to temporarily enjoin the law before it went into effect. That injunction was denied, finding that they were not likely to succeed on the merits. I think in part because of the things that had been identified already. Bruin was very, very clear in cautioning that its opinion on New York's discretionary concealed carry licensing law did not mean that these shall issue licensing laws were unconstitutional under the Second Amendment because, again, they include narrow objective criteria for which a person, if they meet it, they will be issued a license. They specifically identified a background checks and firearm safety training as being, components that are consistent with the Second Amendment. The only thing that they said was that these systems could be put towards abusive ends, either exorbitant fees or excessive wait times. As I mentioned, the Maryland handgun qualification license was upheld by an en banc panel of the Fourth Circuit, and overwhelmingly so. Part of what they identified was that there were not exorbitant fees. Maryland charges a $50 application fee, and there were no excessive waiting times. Maryland allows 30 days for their licensing authority to issue the license, but it was noted as part of the litigation that in one quarter that they had plucked out, no license took longer than 15 days for it to be processed and either approved or denied based on disqualification criteria.
And then once you do the license, you have it, and you don't have to do it again for the other purchases.
Well, so the license in Maryland and a lot of other places can last 5 years, but you are still required to do a point of purchase background check. So
Right.
even if I have received my handgun qualification license, at the time I go to purchase a firearm, I undergo another background check and I am subject to a 7-day waiting period.
And that's just to make sure that things haven't changed since you got the license originally.
Exactly. Since a license can last 5 years, anything could happen in between there. I may, have been convicted of a disqualifying crime. And so we want to make sure that at the time you have the license, you're qualified to purchase. And at the time you're actually purchasing, you're still qualified to purchase.
That's excellent information, and I think it gives us great confidence that we can move forward with this and that it will be upheld by the courts and that we will save lives. So as we sort of start wrapping up, I want to introduce our Virginia lead, Lori Haas. Many of you know Lori, who's been working in the General Assembly for many years after her daughter was wounded in the Virginia Tech shooting. We are very lucky to have Lori as part of our team. Lori's going to say a few words, and then I'm going to pass it on to Delegate Hope and Senator Surovell for some closing comments. So, Lori.
Thank you, Josh, and others and everybody on the call. I just wanted to say hello to everybody who's on the call. As Josh mentioned, for those I have not met, my name is Lori Haas. I live in Richmond and I work at the Virginia General Assembly. I'm down there virtually every day, all day during session, so I'm available to you during the session, and I'm available in advance if you have questions regarding firearm purchase or licensing or other gun violence prevention issues that are going to be making their way through the General Assembly. Please reach out. I'm happy to help and provide you with information and data. And if I don't have the answer, I certainly have a lot of smart colleagues who probably do have the answer. So just wanted to say hello and thank you for coming. And thank you for your interest. And I look forward to working with all of you.
And how will we find you, Lori?
I will make certain that you get my email, but I'll say it out loud here real quick and spell it LHAAS like in Sam, the numeral 9 at jh.edu. And maybe Joe can put that in the chat. Thank you.
That's pretty simple. That's good news. All right.
I like it.
Thanks, Lori.
Thank you
for being here. Thank you for everybody, for Kelly and Cass, for being here. And Delegate Hope, Senator Surovell, please send us home with some inspirational words.
Yeah, Josh, thank you and your team for pulling this together. Look, bottom line is the firearm purchaser licensing will save lives. And I said this at the outset, I think of any single bill that we pass, I think this will save more lives than any one that we've done in the past. And so I'm looking forward to continuing to work with my colleagues, working with other advocates, working with state police, law enforcement, to do something really big here, and so much looking forward to it. But I think that we owe it to Virginians when we see our rates of suicide and homicides continuing to go up, to do some things that will do some real good. And looking forward to getting a bill to the governor and having a bill signing ceremony that can really be meaningful. So thank you again.
Thank you, and Senator Surovell.
Thanks, Josh, and thanks for everybody for being on tonight. And I look forward to meeting all the new state delegates that this latest wave brought in, which I hope hits my chamber in about 2 years. Want to let everybody know that senators don't bite. And the courts committee can be a scary place for some people, but we're not that bad. Feel free to stop by and chat. And I look forward to meeting everybody. With regard to the policy, whenever we have a Democratic governor, House, and Senate, it really creates unique opportunities for us. And I'm really excited about this session, although I also want everybody to understand, be under no pretense, it's also going to be very hard. Governing is not easy. It's very important you get the details right, get the policy good. The courts are very active on this. We have to be very careful about how we do it, make sure that we do it correctly. And at the end of the day, Delegate Hope's correct. This is going to not only save a lot of lives. One of the presentations we heard at the Crime Commission is it's going to save a lot of money. The state spends a lot of money on Medicaid recipients, treating them for firearm injuries. We also bear that cost through our insurance. There's a lot of lost productivity that occurs when these things happen. And of course, the human toll is just massive in terms of what it causes families and their victims when people are injured or killed. And this is a real opportunity for us to make Virginia a safer, more responsible place. And I look forward to partnering with everybody to make that a reality.
Well, thank you to all the panelists. Thank you to Delegate Hope and Senator Surovell. And just we want to thank you for allowing us to present our information. We believe that evidence can make good policy, and we're here to give you the evidence. And thank you for allowing us the opportunity to help organize this and to bring the evidence to the fore, because we think once people see the evidence, they can make great policy decisions. So thank you and good night.